What to do when you're between a rock and a hard place is what I've called this service. And I thought between a rock and a hard place is exactly how some of you must have been feeling. Do you come to church and risk collecting a virus or collecting the ire of the state if you're over 70? What do you do? What do you do if you've got a business and you can't afford to pay your staff anymore? Do you let your staff go, or do you find some other way? And the choice is either letting a few staff go or losing your whole business. That's a dilemma that some people are facing. On a smaller level, we think, well, I've got a workmate who's being a pain. Do I confront him or her and risk their ire, or do I stand up for what is right? It's the same with children, isn't it? Do we stand up to our children and say, no, what your behaviour is not acceptable, and risk their wrath if we upset them? Or do we say, no, we have to train up these children in the way that they should go? And there's always dilemmas and choices, and sometimes the choices are not too easy to decide. Jesus was faced with a dilemma too, this tough choice between paying taxes to Caesar or not. And it was a particularly difficult issue because of a number of things. The first reason was that Jesus was surrounded by a crowd that was really against him. They were there to trap him, it says. And we think about these words when you read there's the Pharisees who were there, but also the Herodians. The Herodians were the party of people who followed the King Herod, and they all had a vested interest in the regime. And Herod was in power because of the Roman government. So if the Roman government lost its power, then Herod would lose his power, and all these people would lose their position and their wealth. So the audience was stacked against Jesus by having the Herodians there. We also see that it was a trick question, as we've said. Should we pay taxes or not? Because on one side, if they said, yes, pay taxes, then he would be at peace with the Romans and the Herodians. But if he said, no, don't pay taxes, the crowd might love him, but he'd be thrown in jail or worse. And we know he's being set up for a trap by the way that they butter him up to start with. They say, we know you're a man of integrity. We know you're a teacher of the way of God. We know that you aren't swayed by what others think. And so Jesus is being buttered up, and they place this challenge before him. And it's part of an ongoing dispute that leads up to Easter between Jesus and the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and other religious leaders. It's a conflict between Jesus, who wants to say, let's do what God wants no matter the cost, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees who say, well, let's just go along with crowd, with what has always been done. Let's go along with keeping peace. Let's go along with man-made rules because they suit us and they're in a vested interest. So what do you do if you're between a rock and a hard place? I think the answer is to look up, to look at something higher, and Jesus did that when he asked for the coin. Because he asked the question. Can we have the next slide, Joanne? The question that Jesus asked was whose face was on the coin and whose name was on it. And it was a picture, of course, of Caesar and of his name. And one of the things we know is that Jewish people didn't like any pictures of people on things. They didn't like any idols. And especially when Caesar was calling himself a god by this time. The idea that he was a god and that his image was on the coin, that the Jewish people would have hated these coins, but they had to use them to pay their taxes. And so Jesus gives this wise answer: give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to give to God the things that are God. Jesus made them look beyond their current dilemma, not just to the tax issue or not, but to say, actually, we belong to God, our whole beings belong to God. Caesar can have our money, but he can't have our allegiance, he can't have our faith, he can't have our love, he can't have our thinking. And it's the same with some of the dilemmas we face. We have to look up and say, well, where is God in all this? What is God saying to us? What is God's plan? How do we find our way through these two difficult choices that we face about our businesses or our taxes or so many different things? And one of the things that Jesus says is that the whole world belongs to God because all human beings are made in God's image. And he says even Caesar himself is made in God's image. So therefore he belongs to God. And so the dilemma for us is not church versus state, but rather to say that the state is under God's control. So the bigger question is not do we pay taxes or something to someone, or how do we face with these dilemmas that we face about What rules should we follow? Should we travel or not? Should we stand a metre apart from everyone? The more important question is, who do I belong to? The more important question is, what does it mean to be an image bearer of God? Because to be an image bearer of God says in this situation, we can comply with the rules or not comply with the rules, and you have the consequences of those to be faced. But what does it mean to belong to God, to be a child of God? What does it mean to say my life is in God's hands, that my health is in God's hands? And if I get sick or not, I know God will be with me. I don't know about you, but one of the things I've been looking at is the shares plummeting. I think, there's my poor KiwiSaver balance disappearing out the back door. And you'll probably be thinking that about your savings too, if they're not just in interest rates. But even interest rates are plummeting. So, okay, my financial future, that's also in God's hands. My job and my business, these things are also in God's hands. And the church is also in God's hands. So why do I fear? The world is in God's hands, and so I have to trust Him. So when I'm caught between a rock and a hard place, I have to look up. I have to see God who is with us. And as Psalm 24 says, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the people and all who made it. Go to the next slide too, please. I was interested to read a quote about Sir Isaac Newton. In 1665, the bubonic plague was going all through England and Europe as well. But in 1665, Cambridge University, where Sir Isaac Newton was a student, he was about 20 or 21, was closed down for a whole year. It was a terrible year. A third of the population of London died that year because of the bubonic plague. But Isaac Newton basically took the year that he was sent home to his family, and during that year he thought about maths. He basically invented calculus during that year. He got some prisms somehow rather than using light to reflection, and he came up with a whole lot of theories and developed a whole lot of scientific advances about light. And it was there that the apple fell down and made him think about gravity, and whether gravity was just something that happened when you're close to the earth, or whether it was something that happened further away. And so all his theories about gravity were developed, or started to be developed in that 1 year. And he went back to Cambridge and became a professor within a year or two. He used that year as time away from the normal routines in order to think, to have space for himself. And I guess that's the challenge for us. What does it mean to be a church? Can we find new ways of worshipping in this crisis? So there's different options. There's television and internet and maybe meeting in a house or learning to worship as a family. There's new ways of loving our neighbour. And so as Christians, we're invited to get to know our neighbours, to share phone numbers with them, to offer to help them. And again, if you're interested in helping people who need groceries or who need medicines picked up, then if you give your name to the office, we'll have a roster, a list of people who are willing to help with that sort of thing. There's new ways of doing pastoral care if we can't do visiting. My uncle died yesterday, and so I've been asked to take the funeral on Tuesday, but it's interesting, they've got just a family funeral on Tuesday, and then in October they're going to have a memorial service when they bury his ashes and invite everyone else who's not able to come to the family funeral. There's different ways of doing things, and so that's a challenge that the people have got. There's new ways of not only doing pastoral care, but new ways of doing outreach. How do we share the good news of Jesus? And obviously the internet's a big way of doing that. Obviously sharing our stories on Facebook, and the church will be increasing the way that we communicate through the internet. But maybe there's more personal ways. We're still going to have the meeting tonight about delivering the hope booklets, where little booklets of the message of God's love are going to get put in every letterbox. And as neighbours, we're encouraged to share why are we not stressed? And that's an assumption, isn't it? Why are we not stressed about the coronavirus? Because we say we trust in God. When we're in between a rock and a hard place, we look up. We look to God, who is the source of all life, the one who'll be with us, who'll get us through. We look to God, who says, "Be still and know that I am God." We look to God to say, "I am the one who have the whole universe in my hands." And so as Christians, we can face the most difficult challenges with a sense of peace, with a sense of knowing God's love is with us. It's 3 weeks till Easter, and I was thinking about the Easter story. Jesus had a dilemma too at Easter time. It was a dilemma of, should he go to the cross knowing that that the cross meant death and suffering and pain and rejection and betrayal? Or did he say, no, it's all about me and my safety and my personal well-being? And he said, I choose the cross because if I choose the cross, people get to experience forgiveness. People get to experience the love of God in a way they would never know without the cross. I choose the cross because I know that the great God holds me, and even though I go through difficult times and pain and suffering, the great God will be with me and he will get me through, and there's resurrection on the other side of death. And so we choose the cross, we choose obedience, we choose faith, even though it's difficult or hard at times, knowing that the great God is with us. And so when we're between a rock and a hard place, we look up to our mighty God who is with us. Let us pray.